The most dangerous moments in the history of empire are almost never the loud, triumphant peaks when power appears absolute. They arrive much later, at the precise moment an aging superpower becomes so deeply intoxicated by its own mythology that it can no longer distinguish genuine structural control from the fading memory of it. That is the trap. That is the historical ambush. And that is exactly where the United States is standing right now, staring directly at the edge of the most humiliating financial reversal of the modern era. What most people still fail to grasp is that empires do not actually die when their armies weaken. They die when the underlying system that financed their illusion of permanence quietly shifts somewhere else. They collapse when the invisible plumbing of trade, reserves, settlement, and trust is no longer routed through their own institutions. The flags may still wave, the speeches may still thunder, the aircraft carriers may still cut across the oceans, but the true source of power has already migrated, and by the time the political class realizes what happened, the mechanism is already gone. That is why the coming end of American financial hegemony will not look like a dramatic battlefield defeat. It will look far worse. It will look like disbelief. It will look like a threat issued from Washington that no longer produces obedience. It will look like a sanction package that no longer terrifies. It will look like a treasury auction that no longer commands reflexive foreign demand. It will look like the exact instant the rest of the world stops pretending that American financial supremacy is permanent. To understand how devastating that moment will be, you have to go back to the historical blueprint that already exposed this exact imperial weakness once before. In 1956, the British Empire was still desperately performing the theater of global dominance. The political elite in London still spoke the language of command. They still believed imperial prestige itself carried material force. They still assumed that because Britain had once ruled the seas, it could continue dictating outcomes in strategically vital regions simply through audacity and tradition. Then came the Suez Crisis. When Egypt nationalized the canal, Britain did not interpret it as a regional dispute. It interpreted it as a direct insult to imperial authority and a threat to a system Britain believed it still controlled. So the British government, alongside France and Israel, moved to seize the canal through military force. On the surface, the operation looked like an assertion of strength. Troops moved. Infrastructure was targeted. Tactical objectives were pursued. British leadership believed it was demonstrating that hard power still answered to London. But Britain had misread the age completely. The world had already changed. The empire that once dominated maritime commerce no longer controlled the financial architecture required to sustain a major geopolitical confrontation. Britain still had soldiers. It no longer had sovereign monetary independence. It still had pride. It no longer had command over the reserve framework that kept its currency credible under pressure. The British government believed the crisis would be settled by military success. In reality, it was settled by financial dependence. The United States did not need to invade Britain. It did not need to confront the Royal Navy. It did not need to fire a single shot. Washington simply looked at Britain's structural vulnerability and tightened its grip around the financial throat of the empire. Britain needed support for the pound. It needed access to dollar stability. It needed external confidence to prevent a catastrophic currency breakdown. The Americans understood that perfectly, and they weaponized that understanding with surgical ruthlessness. That was the real lesson of Suez. Empire in the modern age belongs to whoever controls the settlement layer. It belongs to whoever can determine whether your currency survives a panic. It belongs to whoever can deny emergency liquidity, shape reserve behavior, and turn financial dependence into political obedience. Britain learned in one humiliating episode that imperial memory means absolutely nothing when another power controls the deeper machinery beneath your outward strength. Now look carefully at the United States today, because America is repeating the psychological error of Suez in reverse. For decades, Washington has treated the dollar system as an eternal law of nature rather than a historical arrangement built on trust, incentives, and strategic necessity. American policymakers came to believe that reserve currency status was not merely an advantage, but an unchallengeable birthright. They acted as though the world would always clear trade through dollar channels, always warehouse savings in treasury debt, always depend on American institutions for settlement, and always fear exclusion from the system more than it feared obedience to it. That belief created the modern American imperial posture. It allowed the United States to run vast deficits without immediate discipline. It allowed the federal government to finance extraordinary debt issuance while still enjoying global demand for its obligations. It allowed Washington to punish adversaries through sanctions, reserve seizures, banking restrictions, and payment network exclusion. Most importantly, it created the illusion that America could weaponize the dollar indefinitely without changing how the world felt about holding it. That illusion is now breaking. The critical mistake was not merely printing too much money or borrowing too aggressively or allowing debt to spiral into the tens of trillions. Those are symptoms of imperial overconfidence. The fatal mistake was transforming the global reserve currency from a trusted neutral settlement medium into an openly coercive geopolitical instrument. The moment the dollar ceased to represent safety in the eyes of foreign governments and began to represent conditional access under American political discretion, its long-term foundation began to rot. That process accelerated violently when sovereign reserves became a battlefield weapon. Once the world witnessed that reserves parked inside the Western financial system could be frozen, immobilized, or functionally confiscated under geopolitical pressure, the message was unmistakable. It did not matter whether a country admired America, opposed America, or merely wanted to remain non-aligned. Every central bank, every finance ministry, and every long-range strategic planner received the same terrifying lesson at the exact same time. Assets held inside a system controlled by Washington were not purely reserves. They were hostages to future political alignment. That realization changed everything, because the first rule of sovereign survival is simple. No serious state willingly leaves the core of its national savings exposed to a foreign power that has already demonstrated its willingness to weaponize access. Once that line was crossed, DeDollarization stopped being an ideological slogan and became a rational act of strategic self-defense. The debate ended. The redesign began. Across the Eastern Hemisphere and throughout large parts of the global South, governments started accelerating plans that had previously moved too slowly to frighten Western analysts. Alternative payment rails began receiving real state backing. Bilateral trade arrangements in local currencies expanded. Cross-border settlement systems outside the traditional Western banking choke points moved from theory into deployment. Reserve managers increased gold accumulation with a level of urgency not seen in generations. Treasury exposure stopped looking like a safe store of sovereign surplus and started looking like concentrated political risk. This is where the American establishment still fails to understand the scale of what is happening. They continue to interpret de-dollarization as a public relations campaign, as though the issue were rhetorical rather than structural. They still imagine that because the dollar remains dominant today, tomorrow must belong to the same architecture. They point to current reserve percentages, current settlement data, current bond market depth, and current military alliances as proof that the system remains intact. But that is exactly how late-stage empires think. They confuse current size with future security. They mistake inertia for permanence. They read the present balance sheet and ignore the direction of the flow. The direction is what matters, and the direction is unmistakable. More nations want optionality. More states want insulation. More trade blocs want systems that cannot be shut off by a Treasury press release or a coordinated sanctions regime. More central banks want reserve assets that carry no counterparty jurisdiction. More governments want to reduce the strategic blackmail risk embedded in dependence on the dollar system. None of this requires the dollar to vanish overnight. It only requires the monopoly of trust to fracture. That fracture is the real crisis, because American hegemony was never based simply on using dollars. It was based on the world needing dollars. There is an enormous difference between preference and necessity, between habit and compulsion, between dominance and indispensability. Once the rest of the world develops credible alternatives, American power begins to lose its automatic transmission mechanism. Threats become less effective. Sanctions become leakier. Bond financing becomes more fragile. The privilege remains visible for a while, but the foundation underneath it starts to weaken in silence. Then comes the Suez moment. The modern financial Suez Crisis will arrive the first time Washington attempts to impose a major geopolitical outcome through the old reserve currency playbook and discovers that the targeted actors have already built enough insulation to resist. It will be the first true test of whether the dollar is still a universal command instrument or merely a very large system facing increasingly organized exit routes. That moment will not be academic. It will be global, public, and psychologically devastating. Imagine a serious geopolitical confrontation involving energy flows, shipping access, strategic minerals, or a major regional realignment. Imagine Washington responds the way it has been conditioned to respond for decades, by escalating the language of financial punishment and threatening exclusion from the dollar-centered order. Under the old regime, that threat alone would have triggered panic. Capital would flee, trade partners would retreat, commercial actors would comply preemptively. The financial weapon would work because the target could not survive outside the system. But in the new environment, the reaction is completely different. The targeted states reroute settlement through non-dollar channels. Energy contracts continue in local currencies or commodity-linked structures. Regional banks step into the clearing gap. Reserve drawdowns are absorbed through gold, bilateral swap lines, and parallel payment mechanisms. Trade does not freeze. Compliance does not cascade. Panic does not materialize on the timetable Washington expects. The American establishment then confronts the most dangerous revelation any empire can face. The weapon still exists, but the target has learned how to live through it. That is the end of hegemony, not the day the dollar disappears, not the day every treasury holder sells at once, not the day an official global replacement is announced. The end begins the day coercive financial power fails in full view of the world. The end begins the day countries recognize that disobedience is survivable. Once that lesson is absorbed internationally, the prestige layer collapses much faster than the statistical layer. Confidence breaks before the spreadsheet fully catches up. And when that confidence breaks, the consequences do not remain offshore. For years, the United States has enjoyed the extraordinary privilege of exporting monetary disorder outward. Foreign demand for dollar reserves, dollar assets, and dollar settlement absorbed pressures that would have been far more immediately destructive in a normal national system. America could run larger deficits, monetize more aggressively, borrow more comfortably, and distort more recklessly because the rest of the world was still willing or forced to hold the paper. But what happens when that external absorption mechanism weakens? The answer is brutally simple. The inflationary consequences that were once diffused across a global reserve system begin concentrating back inside the domestic economy. Financing sovereign debt becomes more expensive. The Treasury must compete harder for buyers. Interest costs consume more of the federal budget. Monetary authorities face an impossible choice between defending the debt structure and defending purchasing power. Asset bubbles lose the same liquidity conditions that created them. Imported necessities become more vulnerable to currency weakness. The cost of living rises precisely as the financial foundations of middle-class stability continue to erode. This is the part of the story most people refuse to think about clearly. American financial hegemony was never an abstract prize reserved for economists and diplomats. It shaped the daily survival of ordinary households. It helped support the purchasing power of salaries, the affordability of imports, the structure of pensions, the valuation of stocks, the stability of bonds, and the general assumption that the American consumer could live above the discipline imposed on other nations. If that privilege weakens materially, the domestic standard of living does not adjust gracefully. It resets violently. And the political class is completely unprepared for that reality. They still speak as if reserve currency status can be commanded by declaration. They still behave as if debt markets will forever absorb their issuance without demanding consequence. They still assume that foreign nations will continue financing American deficits while simultaneously accepting strategic subordination. That is not a serious reading of history. That is imperial nostalgia masquerading as policy. The lesson of Suez was never really about Britain. It was about the precise instant a power discovers that prestige cannot substitute for financial sovereignty. It was about the unbearable humiliation of realizing that your outward strength depends on a deeper system you no longer control. It was about the historical cruelty of late recognition. Britain learned that lesson with the pound. America is preparing to learn it with the dollar. And when that lesson arrives, it will not feel like a theoretical transition between reserve frameworks. It will feel like a national shock. It will feel like a country suddenly discovering that decades of monetary excess, debt expansion, and geopolitical overreach were not erased by size. They were merely delayed by privilege. Once that privilege stops functioning at full force, the backlog of consequence arrives all at once. That is why this moment matters so much. The real question is no longer whether the world is searching for alternatives to American financial dominance. It already is. The real question is whether the United States can recognize the historical pattern before the first major failure of coercive dollar power turns a slow structural shift into an undeniable global verdict. Because after that moment, the narrative changes permanently. The aura breaks, the fear premium collapses, the world reorganizes faster, and the domestic cost becomes impossible to hide. Empires rarely recognize the exact second their financial supremacy ends. They only recognize it afterward, when the mechanism no longer responds, when the threats no longer land, and when the people at home are forced to pay for illusions that should have been abandoned years earlier. That is the true modern Suez Crisis, and it is moving toward the United States with far more speed than most Americans can currently imagine.